So I'm not a huge fan of fishing minigames. They tend to be pretty bland and one-note and require you to play them well beyond the point where they stop being entertaining. But what happens when you sit down and try to flesh that activity out enough to build an entire game around it? Then, you get something a little more engaging. Moonglow Bay, a game all about reviving a quiet and superstitious little seaside town through a whole lot of fishing, now takes the crown for one of the best video game representations of fishing I've personally played. It's not that much more complicated than all those fishing minigames, and it's certainly not perfect, but thanks to an immensely satisfying control system, is far more enjoyable. But it wasn't satisfied with doing just that. There's a whole other half to this game where you cook all those fish you just caught that's even more satisfying, as well as some gestures towards a quieter, more contemplative story that strikes out well beyond what most games like to talk about. As always, I'm Alex, and this is First 5, where I ask if games are worth your time, not your money. I played a game for 5 hours, and I'm gonna tell you if those were 5 hours well spent. And today we're bringing a fishing town back from the brink in Moonglow Bay. Before we get too deep into the review, I did receive a free review copy of this game, so heads up. It must be Cozy Games Month here at First 5, because right on the heels of another game I compared to Stardew Valley comes a game about slowly reviving a beaten-down rural community through the power of fishing and slowly repairing the town, one business purchase and found friend at a time. But unlike last week's Let's Build a Zoo, that's about where the Stardew Valley comparisons end for Moonglow Bay, which not only plays at a completely different rhythm with a greater focus on short-term tasks and moment-to-moment gameplay, but also featuring a much more directed narrative and more interesting characters to befriend than Stardew Valley ever had. But without dwelling on those comparisons, there are 3 major things that stand out to me about Moonglow Bay. 1, its gameplay, which has a delightful level of tactile verisimilitude to it you don't usually find using a controller. 2, what it decides to talk about with its narrative, which while perhaps not revolutionary, is still unique enough to make it genuinely stand out from the crowd. And 3, a very, very awkward opening 30 minutes. Let's focus on the good stuff first, though, because 90% of the game is pretty positive. Perhaps not coincidentally, a good 75% of it is unfiltered gameplay, which is largely split between 2 activities: fishin' and cookin'. And during the entire time, Moonglow Bay is laser-focused on capturing the physical feeling of both these activities through mimicking them with your controller. So as an example, when you go out fishing and have something on the line, you start holding the right trigger to reel it in, but in the meantime, the fish starts thrashing around in different directions, and you have to point the left stick in the opposite direction to pull them back as you keep reeling. Add in a sharp tug you can make with the other trigger to yank the fish in the direction you're pulling, and that's pretty much the entirety of Moonglow Bay's core mechanical system. And I'll be entirely honest, this system is neither deep nor particularly challenging. In fact, it's hilariously abusable and broken, to the point where most fish I can catch in under a second before the minigame even begins. And perhaps even more damningly, you can get a lot more fish even more easily and efficiently using a fishing net at specific spots on the map instead. And so I rarely actually ever busted out my fishing line and actually participated in Moonglow Bay's main raison d'etre. But despite all these nitpicking complaints, it does feel immensely good to play with just on the physical level because of how well the motions you make on the controller map to what you're actually doing on screen. In most games, a controller provides a relatively thick layer of artifice between the player and what's happening in the game, one so universally accepted that it barely registers. And in 90% of cases, it's a necessary evil, boiling sword-fighting styles that would take years to master into a few simple buttons you can pick up in a handful of minutes, or translating incredibly complicated actions a controller just can't mimic down to a single button press. But everything Moonglow Bay does is focused on making that barrier of artifice as thin as possible. And so while this gameplay might not be particularly satisfying, it is physically gratifying in a way few games, especially games as short and quick to pick up as this one, are. And yes, this does mean that you pretty much have to use a controller if you want to play this game. I wouldn't even bother trying with anything else. This same philosophy is extended out to the cooking half of the gameplay as well. When you wash ingredients, you have to follow this blue bar back and forth like you're scrubbing them down. When you boil something, you stir by, again, following the blue bar in circles with the left analog stick. These little cooking minigames are even simpler than the fishing, but also even more satisfying as you blow through dozens of successive tasks in a handful of minutes. It's very easy to fall into a state of flow as you go from one step to the next. in all, Moonglow Bay's gameplay makes for a pretty average but frictionless experience that is largely elevated by how few games are doing much comparable to it. Yeah, sure, there are plenty of comfy, wholesome games, and even a few about more mundane slice-of-life activities like fishing, but it's rare to come across a game that's so tactilely satisfying, and more than any mechanical twist, that's what made Moonglow Bay enjoyable for me. And that summary is about the same for the narrative side, too. By and large, it's perfectly serviceable despite the occasional glaring flaw, but it makes enough unique decisions to make it worth checking out anyway. Moonglow Bay starts on a bit of an awkward foot as it introduces a significant other, immediately fridges them, sends the protagonist through a depressive episode, and pulls them back out of it, all in the span of 5 minutes. And all of this with a tutorial worked in there to boot. It's a similar setup to that one montage in Up, but it doesn't do any of the legwork to earn any of these story beats. This is a game that's mostly focused on the gameplay, and it's in such a rush to get you to it that the setup doesn't have any time to breathe, much less hook you to a compelling story. It also doesn't help that Moonglow Bay is trying to tell a quieter, more emotional story, even complete with cutscenes, but then goes and makes the decision to use one of the least emotive art styles they could have possibly picked, voxel art, to tell that story with. They're kind of working with one arm behind their back here. But in general, Moonglow Bay's main storyline continues much in the same vein, occasionally amusing, regularly quietly heartwarming, but often kept short, simple, and serviceable to keep the priority firmly on the gameplay loop. But then you get to the optional side conversations, and suddenly, there's plenty to enjoy about this game's writing. What I appreciate most about Moonglow Bay's story is the game's willingness to give its main character an actual personality, and that shines through most during side conversations you can have with many of the island's residents. So many other games that have these formalized social link style conversation systems have this awkward habit of making those conversations entirely about the person you're befriending, while your avatar just sits there, nods every once in a while, and generally agrees with everything they're saying. Instead, there were 2 scenes that really stuck out with me from Moonglow Bay, both of which heavily involved the protagonist. One had them talking with a kid about what he wants to do when he grows up, and in trying to give advice, the protagonist basically just described what they did with their life in those years. It's a quiet and small moment, but also a personal one that really worked and served to humanize both its characters. The other has the protagonist philosophizing with another person about the nature of creation, and ends up being an almost reversal of how these scenes usually go, with a companion being the one interrogating the protagonist until they come to a few realizations about themselves. These are all scenes that most games with their blank slate, easily projectable main characters can't really do, and it's frankly more refreshing to see it here than it should be. Another nice twist is the cast itself, which is almost entirely composed of the elderly and middle-aged, be they businessmen just trying to get by, gossiping elders, or one particularly delightful retired treasure hunter. These sorts of characters tend to be entirely invisible in this medium, and yet you not only play as someone in their twilight years, but interact almost exclusively with others who are as well. The actual storytelling itself is perfectly fine, if perhaps not about to go winning any awards, but the fact that there are exceptionally few video games even interested in telling a story like this makes it worthwhile. And while we're on the topic of worth, let's ask the big question. What do you get out of 5 hours with Moonglow Bay? This game's divided up into separate chapters that each take about 3 hours to finish, but I couldn't tell you for sure how many chapters are left to go. I have hit the point, however, where I'm starting to wrap up a decent number of side plots, have seen most of the map, and I'm steadily marching through the game's list of cooking recipes. It doesn't feel like a game with much more than a dozen hours of gas in it though, and what I've played has been pretty comfortable, frictionless, and entertaining. Moonglow Bay is a game about small pleasures. The small pleasures in the narrative of getting to stop and gossip with your friend over a home-cooked meal, yes, but also the small pleasures of its design. The little surprises of just how good this game feels in your hands that just makes it pleasant to play moment to moment, and the random places the story goes that almost no other game would touch. Normally, I'd call Moonglow Bay a perfectly cozy and respectable, if average game, and recommend that if cozy games are your jam, you can't go wrong playing it. But Moonglow Bay just makes too many unique decisions to stop there. It's not the best game you'll play all year. I even have 4 other games I'd rather be playing right now, but it does feel like an important part of a maturing medium, one willing to tell different stories about different people in new ways, and that needs to be treasured and encouraged. Moonglow Bay is far more rare of a game than it should be, and it deserves your love and attention. Hey, by the way, I've got a Patreon. If you enjoyed the video enough to get all the way here, you should go throw money at it. But thank you for watching all the way through. I hope you enjoyed this review of Moonglow Bay, and I'll see you all next time.